Welcome back to Bitcoin and Beyond. Today we have Rich Rhines, a contributor at CoreDAO, to talk about Core and their consensus model, their liquid Bitcoin staking, and more. Rich, welcome in.
Thanks so much for having me. Really excited to chat with you both again. Really enjoyed these in the past, so happy to dive right in. So Core is a Bitcoin-powered L1 blockchain that's fully EVM compatible, trying to unlock the $1.5 trillion of trapped Bitcoin liquidity. Went to mainnet via fair launch in early 2023. Now it's got this community of millions of folks all around the world and have some really novel innovations to kind of chat through as we walk through this deck. A little bit about me. So I'm an initial contributor at Core. Prior to that, I was at Coinbase for 3.5 years, led all money movements engineering. Before that, some other crypto companies, as well as started a bunch of startups. I've been a 0 to 1 guy my entire life. Diving in, I gave a brief kind of overview here. There's so much trapped Bitcoin liquidity here today. People want more. We've seen whether it's with ordinals, BRC20s, now runes, like Bitcoin is back. And we're really outside of the shadow of the block size wars for the first time since 2017. Lightning really isn't, kind of the blessed scaling solution anymore. People are hungry for more options here. And that's a gap that Core saw even before kind of Bitcoin came back into vogue. But it's amazing to see all these teams trying to launch Bitcoin L2s, new decentralized applications. Bitcoin is now once again cool to develop on, which is so awesome to see as someone who's been in the space now for 11 years. With all that goodness, there's challenges to building stuff on Bitcoin, right? There's no native staking yield, there's no smart contracts, there's no native financial primitives, and it's not scalable. Core changes this. It gives all these opportunities to be able to do more with your Bitcoin, really trying to separate the Bitcoin asset from the Bitcoin rails. And that doesn't mean that Bitcoin itself isn't valuable or important. It's this really hardened, secure settlement layer. It's just now the ability, and this is kind of the new mindset of getting more of your Bitcoin might involve bridging or HTLC atomic swapping over to higher throughput, low cost ecosystems like Core. And that's really kind of the problem statement that Core was here to solve. Diving in a little bit more. So Bitcoin itself is still easily the largest crypto asset by market cap. This cycle, this could even grow. The past few cycles we've seen it shrink as all these new protocols, all tell once things have launched, but still easily the dominant asset. And this separating from the rails is so important because Bitcoin itself, again, has this super secure proof of work that balances all these different economic actors. But because it's so slow and costly to use, when you try to make Bitcoin do things it's not meant to do, the chain itself doesn't work really well, right? And we've seen all the fees that were generated and how expensive the runes mint were right after the halvening. It's amazing to see all this economic activity. And maybe Bitcoin long-term lives as this decentralized minting platform for a lot of these new assets. But then maybe once these things are minted, they go into these other ecosystems where they can be lend and borrow. They can have kind of these additional utilities, built on top of it. And this again is what we refer to as separating of the Bitcoin asset from the rails. Is if you can get your Bitcoin in a safe way, which is really important because you shouldn't get involved in any ecosystem if you don't know what the risks are and what the trust assumptions underlying that bridge or that swap are, you should not use it. But if you understand you are comfortable with those things, then being able to go into these new ecosystems that have this hotbed of DeFi and other activity is really an exciting place. Happy to keep going or maybe pause there.
Yeah, I think the general trend is all right, so there's a couple forces at play here, right? Where the way proof of work works and the general shift away from some of the pure maximalism of kind of the vibe of Bitcoin, keeping the core ethos and core principles for the long-term kind of sustainability and protocol dynamic, but we need to take this idea of this hard money and maintain that. But then, as you're saying, the network itself, let's figure out a way to fulfill the promise of this hard money by creating a network of value atop of the kind of L1. And we were thinking about originally calling this series Bitcoin Goes Modular even, but I think it's almost what we're kind of getting at here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's, oh, sorry. Go, Robbie.
I'm just going to echo like Andy's point here. There's a few different ways to look at it, but ultimately doesn't really change what's going on. which is that Bitcoin is now getting separated from its rails, as you mentioned. It's going modular. It's scaling horizontally. And this is an experiment that Ethereum has set out with their rollup-centric roadmap. And I tend to think of Ethereum as kind of like an experimentation field for Bitcoin. It's proven successful in Ethereum world, and now let's see if it translates over to Bitcoin.
Man, I don't want to get into the L2 debate here. No, I'm kidding. But in terms of the comments you guys both made around scalability, I think it's a really good point. And I talk about this kind of from like an OG Bitcoin perspective. Is Bitcoin was meant to be money originally, right? And we've kind of settled this store of value for the last 10 years. But ultimately, that the real vision at the beginning was to be money, and to do that, you just can't do it on Bitcoin L1, right? It's too slow, it's too expensive. It is this perfect settlement layer. Digital gold in of itself is a use case that I don't think was fully envisioned at the time, but it's incredible that it's there and that it exists. But in order to fully realize that, we need to be on these cheaper, faster rails, whether they're side chains or L2s. But totally agree with what you guys both said. I also love the experimentation layer for Bitcoin. I wasn't going to be the one to say that, but I view it very similarly.
You better watch out. Those core maxis are going to come for you.
I'm worried about the ETH maxis, not the core maxis. But awesome. Well, thanks so much for kind of the commentary there. So yeah, as I was kind of briefly summarized earlier, again, we identified some of these things with Bitcoin that it maybe doesn't fully meet and kind of the new demands that are placed on Bitcoin, and that's ultimately what Core is here to answer. And I gave a brief kind of overview at the beginning that Core came to mainnet in early 2023, so it's been live now for almost 18 months. But it was important to kind of talk about some of the origin story of how kind of Core came into being. And Core was really reactionary in a way that, when looking at the kind of problem statement, Bitcoin holders have been largely like left out of kind of the last, let's call it 5+ years of scaling in crypto, beyond just kind of sitting on their Bitcoin. And there needed to be this alignment with these next gen scaling systems had to actually bring the Bitcoin holders and also the Bitcoin miners into consensus in order to align everyone. And we call that Bitcoin alignment. And now it's a term that's getting popularized by more folks out there. And that's really important, because by having this Bitcoin alignment, you actually have the option to meet maybe some of the issues that the Bitcoin network is facing. And like one of the classic examples there is whether or not the Bitcoin network will be able to survive just based on transaction fees. That's always been kind of the question with the hard ratchet nature of the monetary policy. Again, one of the more beautiful aspects of Bitcoin, but there's always been kind of that doubt around it. And with that, Core's consensus mechanism actually reward Bitcoin holders through Bitcoin staking, and then also Bitcoin hash delegates. It's really designed to loop in all the different aspects of Bitcoin. It was also important that for those Bitcoin holders, that there were products built for all of these different holders. Because if you think about it, Bitcoiners are commonly lumped into one group, like on Twitter, right? Like people like to summarize Bitcoin as like laser-eyed maxis and that sort of thing. But in reality, that's not true. And we've seen so much of that over the last 18 months or so, since like ordinals first came into being. There's people who want to use NFTs, that want to do tokens, that want to earn yield. There's all these different use cases. It's important that in order to unlock the full 1.5 trillion, you have to have solutions for everyone. Otherwise, like the identity doesn't hold. And it's important that we don't leave folks behind, because that's how we create these unbalanced ecosystems that are maybe good at one thing, but not truly like L1 generic. And then finally, it had to be a fair launch. And that was very important, because if you think about one of the reasons that Bitcoin became so popular, it was because the holders of Bitcoin were the early network participants. And those early network participants became the underlying constituent base of the network. And that's very different relative to most other chains that came into existence over the last, let's call it 5 to 7 years, whereas really this insiders versus outsiders dynamic, and trying to ensure that the holders were the early users really is important for the long run. It's one of the reasons that the core Toshi community is so strong. I put them right up against the Link Marines or any other of the really notable crypto communities. Now on to some of the technical bits, and I know this is what y'all wanted to really kind of dive into, and I think this is a great part, and I assume there'll be some questions on this one as well. But this is kind of one of the more special aspects of Core is its Satoshi Plus consensus. And the idea of Satoshi Plus is actually like 3 different parts. On one side, you've got the delegated proof of work. That's the Bitcoin miners producing blocks on the Bitcoin L1 and delegating those into Core's consensus. Then there's the Bitcoin stakers who lock Bitcoin on Bitcoin L1 to help contribute to the economic security of the network. And then finally, you have the Core holders who lock their Core tokens. And the way to think about it is you get this mesh of different ingredients in your DPoS soup in terms of trying to attack the validator set, each one adding some amount of security relative to the security that it's bringing to the network. But it was a novel mechanism that we've, again, recently added to with Bitcoin staking, and hopefully we'll go multi-chain later this year, early next year.
Yeah, I just want to double click on Satoshi Plus here. And so I love the idea of a DPoS soup, delegated proof of stake made up of each of these components. And so we can think of, okay, so first zooming out a little bit, we have cryptoeconomic security like proof of stake networks, which is pretty much everything except Bitcoin. And then Bitcoin, which is made up of more cryptographic security, which is, more mathematical, more, you can almost think of this as like, I don't want to say ZKproofs, but like it's more cryptographic, right? So that cryptoeconomic security, we would consider Core Chain in that camp, right? The cryptoeconomic camp, because it mixes, maybe it's a mix of both actually, as I'm thinking about it now, because we do get this delegated hashing power that's cryptographic, and then we also get the economic security of Bitcoin and Core that is staked into the network. Could you just kind of like, I know that was sort of a brain spill, but could you kind of pull all of that together for us?
Totally. It was actually pretty on point, I think, when you think about it. So we actually refer to it as a hybrid mechanism, to your point. So it's like you get aspects of these different consensus mechanisms. And it's important also, I'll do one more zoom out, as you mentioned, to think about why the system came into being this way. And when when the system was originally being designed, like most original like Bitcoin sidechains use merge mining. It comes all the way from Satoshi. He hypothesized this way to, secure other chains, get more rewards. Like there was kind of this, like it's a long, I think it was like 2014 or no, it's maybe 2010, I think. Like it's very early Bitcoin of when like merge mining first came into being. Then there was like this initial wave of merge mine chains, and then you eventually got to like rootstock and some of these other things. And merge mining is amazing in some ways, right? You get to reuse like the existing horsepower that you're adding to the Bitcoin chain. However, you get some of these negative externalities that folks don't often talk about, which is you have these really high powered instances that can take over your network if they don't like you. And it kind of creates these weird balances where the economic alignment between the miners and the chains might not actually be aligned. And that was something that we had studied and thought really deeply about, which is like, hey, how do you blend these two things without maybe sacrificing, some of your own security of your network? And that's where kind of this delegated proof of work came into play, where the miners receive rewards helping to secure the core chain, but they have no incentive to censor blocks or to go against the core network. And that was super important. If you look at some of the other, like now called L2s and that sort of thing, they've had issues with miners in the past who censored their blocks because it's actually in their economic interest to actually be Byzantine to some degree. And that was really important to get correct. And on the delegated proof of stake side, that's kind of more classic, if you will. Hey, you're a core token holder, you then delegate to a validator in the network. The Bitcoin staking really came into play, and this again, we announced this token 2049, so a little over a month ago. By the time this airs, there'll be over 2,000 Bitcoin staked, which is pretty cool. It's like 150 million USD, and there's a bunch more on the way. It's also powering the first yield-bearing ETP with Valor. And the idea here was, hey, the miners are participating in consensus. How do we now reward the Bitcoin holders? And it was very important when this was being designed that it had to be riskless. And that's very important. You think about Bitcoin holders, they don't want to do things that are risky, or they might lose their Bitcoin. And Bitcoiners are very special in that their ultimate goal in life typically is to go earn more Bitcoin. It's not like Ethereum, other things, people want more cash, that sort of thing. Bitcoiners want more Bitcoin. So anything that can make them part with that, comes with a lot of concern. And that's where the time lock comes in. So if you think about proof of stake, you lock up those funds typically either delegating or as part of your validator that you're running if it's more POS. On the Bitcoin chain, we don't have smart contracts. We don't have that ability, but what we do have is hash time locks, check contract verify, or check time lock verify, etc. And you can actually provably lock up those funds, which gives you a very similar idea under the hood to locking those locking those on a validator as you would in POS. And the way to think about it is we look at these three ingredients of the soup, which I'm now going to use as my new thing going forward. And that's how the validators get elected. We look at these relative contributions of the different actors in the network to these different validators, and then select the top 10.
Crypto
Got it.
Go strong.
Yeah, and maybe we can go with it. I think on the next slide, you've got a bit more of like the diagram of kind of how it works under the hood. I think it would probably be helpful for Rob to wrap his head around kind of like the hybrid mechanism here. And maybe you can just take us through this as well.
Yeah, so let me dive into the Bitcoin centric side first, because again, I think that's like the most unique part of the core system. So if we talk about the Bitcoin miner, how are they actually delegating their hash, or the mining pool more specifically? Well, when they produce a block on the Bitcoin chain, they add some data to the OP return field. And then as part of that, there's an actor in the core system that relays over those blocks. There's another actor called a verifier that can flag any malfeasance, like forged block headers, that sort of thing. And the relayer is also running an on-chain light client for Bitcoin. We calculate that on a 1 week delay, because with that, it prevents reorg and some of these other like kind of nasty cases. Kind of a brute force engineering solution, but it's also beautiful, and then it kind of solves some of these nastier issues that kind of cause other things issues. And then with that, we look at that again on the 1 week delay, and that's like one piece of your hybrid score for getting elected. On the Bitcoin staking side, you do that hash time lock. So you actually lock it to yourself. So it's fully non-custodial, and it's a configurable time. So you can do, I think, a minimum of 10 days, and there's no max, I think, currently. There's no term structures yet in place, but that's actually something that's on the roadmap as well, to actually give people different reward rates, or different groups, I should say, for kind of the duration of how long they lock. The relayers in that case, again, also pick those things up and bring that over as part of that validator election. And then finally, kind of the boring part, but kind of the heart of the entire thing, if you will, is the kind of more classic, delegated proof of stake, where any core holder can then pick a validator to go delegate to, either directly or through, the native LST on the core platform. And that's really important as well. Is like core has this very egalitarian nature, and that's why delegated proof of stake was chosen. We couldn't have a high minimum, couldn't have anything that would like rule people out from participating. Had to make it really easy, low barrier to entry, not just for voting and that sort of thing, but also for participating consensus and earning rewards.
Okay, cool. All right, so that is a good like understanding of how the Bitcoin side works, and then kind of tying it into the core side. And some of those brute force engineering decisions are made out of highest level of security, but also kind of like with the current setup that you have. Some like what we're learning through this series, like the Bitcoin network, you have to make certain design choices that you don't necessarily have to always make in other networks, based on the parameters and the immutability almost of Bitcoin, where it's like it's tough to kind of change things that are already existing, because to kind of keep that hardness of the money, if you will. And so kind of coming to that point, a couple questions about the Satoshi Plus. Here we have a slash module. Is there slashing active right now on core chain? Is there slashing that happens regularly, or kind of what is the process there and the incentive structure to ensure validator alignment, trust, etc.?
Yeah, so there is slashing of the validators in core. It's happened a few times, but due to validators going offline versus like a double sign or something of that nature. And those are, I believe, I'd have to check the docs, but I believe those are the two like easiest cases, which are like the double sign, and then when you're just missing blocks. And then as a result, you either lose a portion of your deposit and you get like jailed for some period, or if you commit like a felony or whatever, you lose your deposit and you're kicked out for a long period of time, or potentially forever. We haven't had anyone try the latter case, but we've had some validator downtime issues or whatever. The network itself has never experienced downtime, but individual validators have like missed blocks.
Yeah, I remember from the staking summit, there was a discussion about like these two slashing conditions and why it is like much less egregious to just go down like if there is any potential like risk of safety or making a double sign, it's better to just like turn your validator off than commit some sort of like unsafe action to the network. So that makes a lot of sense on those two conditions. I did have a question. Okay, so when we were talking about the delegated proof of stake, there was two economic components and then that one cryptographic component. It makes sense that when we're talking about the economic components of Core and Bitcoin, the validators are putting up these economic assets. Those would be the assets that get slashed if they commit one of those two infractions. In the cryptographic sense, what gets slashed if a validator commits some sort of like faulty hashing power or something, or what is the mechanism there that enforces slashing for the cryptographic component?
Yeah, so you've got a couple different checks and balances. So one, on the relayer would have to commit a bad action in that case. Like imagine they're bringing over bad block headers or something of that nature. The relayer would have their deposit slashed for doing so. Anyone can act as the verifier. So that's kind of your check and balance on that side. But that's orthogonal to like validator slashing, if you will. On the validator side, it is DPoS. In DPoS, it's important to like kind of zoom in on this. In DPoS, you are not bringing your own capital. You can do that as optional, but it's these other people that are providing that capital to you. And in this case, those other people actually aren't doing anything wrong, right? Like it's the validator in this case that is actually the one that's being malfeasant because they're choosing to double sign or to do something similar. So at least in our viewpoint, like because they're not actually doing anything bad, they shouldn't be penalized for doing so. That's a hotly debated topic, if you will, right? Like there's some folks that think slashing shouldn't be used at all. Like, maybe you need to go all the way down to individual delegates, kind of like a Kava-like system. There's no like tried or true thing there. But in the core system, we try to punish those that are acting Byzantine, whether it's a relayer or a validator in that case, not their delegates. That thumbs up emoji thing was super cool. I have no idea how you did
that. Yeah, that was the all good. Appreciate the in-depth take. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. We already talked a bunch about that. I did miss one important thing. Thank God we have the slides here. So yeah, we're about 50% or a little over 50% of the Bitcoin hash that's currently securing the core network, which is pretty awesome. I think when we set out to, kind of launch this thing and everything else, early last year, we would have been pretty happy with, maybe like 15% at this point or that sort of thing. But the adoption's been pretty great, which not only helps, kind of tie in the Bitcoin alignment, but also helps to keep, the chain safe and secure, which we always appreciate. We call it the road to 100. We won't be satisfied until we get to 100. Most folks kind of like stop out around this level, but we think there's a pretty clear path to keep chugging down the road to 100. Bitcoin staking, I did a fair sorry.
Sorry, I don't want to slow your roll too much there, but I do think mining, like this is still sort of like flying under the radar. I think for most people, like they just don't have a clear understanding of like who the miners are, like what the decentralization of the mining of Bitcoin looks like nowadays. Could you just give us like a status update on like what the state of Bitcoin mining is? Who are the miners, and generally also, what has your experience been with working with some of these larger mining groups?
Yeah, so let me do a quick overview here as well. So what's important to understand about Bitcoin that's different than many of these other systems is you have these folks that aggregate these mining pools who produce the blocks, but they are actually not the ones that have the underlying hash power. They might have their own miners as well, but it's actually contributed from all of these other miners. So it's actually quite decentralized as a group of people that have machines running. But then you have these smaller groups that are actually the ones that produce the blocks. They distribute those back to the people that are actually like doing the computations. Like that's kind of the rough way to think about it. And Bitcoin sometimes gets criticized as like, hey, look, there's like, 8 or 9 or like whatever that number is today of like these groups that control all the hash. But that's not really true. If these mining pools were starting to do Byzantine things, people would just switch their hash over to a different mining pool. So it's not the same as you're the one that is actually like has the stake or whatever as like kind of a proof of stake system, right? You see those other centralization kind of discussions get brought up with like Lido and some of these other things, which I also don't necessarily agree with, but it's important to note in the Bitcoin system, there is like total separation there. And then in our experience, we work with several different mining pools. A lot of them, Bitcoin OGs, been in the space for a very long time, want to see a very decentralized Bitcoin, but are also very aware that this ratchet monetary policy of Bitcoin is challenging to their business for the long run. And that's important for them to look at diversifying additional sources of revenue. I think, some of our friends at Marathon and that sort of thing who we've been, friends with, I don't think they're on Core yet, but as part of that, they've been very vocal about how it's so important for this business of long-term finding other sources of revenue streams. And they've actually taken it to the extreme of launching their own L2, which is really cool. And I think we'll start to see other miners do some of these things as well. But the other cool part about the miners is a lot of these folks are sitting on quite a bit of Bitcoin. They're getting active in some of these, Bitcoin L2s, whether it's like participating in some of these like yield strategies or other things. But I think that'll be a big story of kind of the earliest folks that were in crypto getting back involved and starting to lead some of the forefront of this innovation. Happy to double click on all the above, but that's a pretty good overview, I think.
Yeah, that is really helpful. I think it makes a ton of sense. One, because the Bitcoin miners have a ton of Bitcoin. They want to kind of activate that and get some yield or some sort of active value. And then two, because once these miners exhaust and the network itself runs enough halvings that there is no more block reward, the year 2140, something like that, they're totally dependent on transaction fees. And so it only makes sense that they would try to bolster these L2s to generate some more transaction fees on the Bitcoin L1. That part makes a ton of sense. I think maybe just one question as far as like, why are these, I just maybe don't fully understand like the aggregation model of these Bitcoin like mining pools. Why are the smaller miners committing their hashing power to the mining pools? Like, what is the separation of responsibilities there?
Yeah, it's a good question. And before I dive into that, you talked about 2140, which is when it goes to zero. There's a lot of people that are worried like 2 halvings from now, 1 halving from like it's a much more imminent problem, I think, than it maybe is like kind of commonplace knowledge, just because we haven't seen a sustainable source of Bitcoin revenue on L1 from transaction fees. We've seen these periods where it's like wildly profitable, right? But how long does that stay? There's a lot of questions there. So I think it is like a very short-term thing people are looking to solve. And then to the other question of like, why do you use a mining pool? So Bitcoin block production is probabilistic. So because of that, if you actually aggregate, you can smooth out the rewards. So if you get a bunch of people together and they all have like a good amount of hash or whatever, your combined probability of getting a smaller amount of the block reward is higher. And that is very common. And I can't remember exactly when Bitcoin mining pools came into place, but it's very common for that very reason, is a way to just kind of smooth it all out.
Andy, that reminds me of our days where I remember looking at like running like some miners allegedly on like some computers or electricity that was like part of an institution and not maybe my personal ownership of that electricity. And so that's where it made more sense to like not solo mine a Bitcoin. I may never happen to like mine 1 Bitcoin block, but to contribute some hashing power or electricity to a pool and then get like a portion of rewards from everyone in that pool. So yeah, I remember that from like the 2016, 17, 18 era makes a ton of sense.
But what is so special about Bitcoin is there is a probability that you would be able to produce a block on your own, which is something that no other chain, at least to my knowledge, has been able to replicate, at least at like the smallest scale. So awesome. So let me dive into a little bit about non-custodial Bitcoin staking, because we announced it again a little over a month ago. We've seen pretty solid amount of adoption so far, thousands of Bitcoin staked. We think many more are coming online soon. We're super excited about it. Bitcoin's now a yield-producing productive asset for the first time. Not only is this amazing for Bitcoin holders that never want to participate in DeFi, which is a huge percent of the Bitcoin folks, which is a totally fine way to stop as well. You don't have to do things that you're not comfortable with. Going back into my original piece that I started out with, if you don't know the trust assumptions, you're not comfortable with it, just stay on Bitcoin L1. But with that, this new kind of possibility was, hey, how do we solve this problem where you can earn passive yield on Bitcoin for the first time? And there's a bunch of different ways that you can do that. And this has been like a popular thing that people have been talking about now, let's call it maybe a little over like the last year. People have talked about Bitcoin staking. And you have to ask yourself, like, what Bitcoin staking means. Are you actually securing something, or is it some sort of actually like financial product under the hood, maybe like a tokenized basis trade or maybe riskier strategies? Not that those aren't like totally viable things that people want, but just again, understanding where the yield comes from. If you don't know what the yield is, you are the yield. We've all seen that story like multiple times over. So this was a product designed for Bitcoin holders. A lot of customer development interviews went into it, a lot of our own experience. And the idea of the time lock really came into place where we ourselves wouldn't be comfortable giving up the keys to our Bitcoin or having a chance that our private keys were revealed as part of this process. Again, people have different solutions. We'll see, how the Bitcoin eventually flows into all of these. There's so much Bitcoin to go around. It'll flow into a bunch of different places. It's not going to be winner take all. But it was really important that it could be a product that even the large institutions all the way to the smallest Bitcoin holder would be comfortable using. And that was very important to unlock the total, Bitcoin asset base. And how it works is you just use a native Bitcoin function, which I believe is check, time, lock, verify. And the idea is you just lock it to yourself. So you're essentially provably encumbering those funds in one transaction for a minimum period of about 10 days, although that's configurable. And then after those 10 days, you can then unlock with a second transaction. But it's all native Bitcoin, didn't require any soft fork or any changes like that. Again, having been in the space for a long time, you have to make things really simple, really easy to be able to onboard a lot of folks to it. And we've got this nice handy diagram that talks all about it. And then just, again, the high level thing that I just mentioned, again, this is great for hodling, your keys, your coins, and now it's yield producing asset.
So is it like, because there's this locked Bitcoin and wallet B, you can then call that smart contract on core chain and effectively add that to the, like, does that add to the security and consensus of core as well? Or like, what is having that locked Bitcoin in that for that time period allow you to do from the core perspective to use that consensus or use that capital? And I don't know where this thing keeps coming from.
the thumbs up everywhere. It only works for you somehow. But yeah, so let me kind of explain it. So when you issue that, again, Bitcoin does not have smart contracts. So there's no, like, you do it on Bitcoin and then it like pings us or something else. That would be incredible, but it would also, again, cause too much surface area Bitcoin, in my opinion. So essentially when you issue that transaction, there's this relayer that's, again, watching or like overseeing the Bitcoin blockchain. As it relays that over, it then goes into the system smart contracts that then calculate it. But they're like two processes, if you will. And then to the question of like, what does it actually do for the core chain? So using that like DPoS soup analogy that we used earlier, is it becomes another hard to acquire quantity. And that's kind of the way to think about it, is like when you want to look at attacking kind of the core validator set, it's acquiring like three things that are hard to get a lot of. Right. And that's the idea, versus like in traditional DPoS, if you will, you just have to get a lot of one thing. And that, again, like can be super secure, don't get me wrong. But the way that we kind of think about it is almost like it's like an aggregated DPoS, right? Like you've got these different ingredients that make it hard to kind of take over.
Gotcha. And why is this, and like, why is this method more secure than something like doing like a wrap Bitcoin and then staking it or putting it into like a different smart contract on core or on a different chain? I'm kind of teeing you up here, I think.
I was gonna say the tee is up. Yeah, so to kind of go through it. So this is totally non-custodial, and that's really important because not your keys, not your coins. Like that's yours forever. This is truly passive yield. If you think about like bridging or like swapping or whatever, which we fully support, and we actually have core BTC and then HTLC atomic swaps will get released later this month. Those are totally viable options for folks, and we don't discourage it. They're just for different holders because your bridge has some risk involved in it, right? Like it's just how it goes. With swapping, these are atomic swaps, so again, it's a hash time lock, so there's not risk there. But in general, people view going from one ecosystem to the other as very scary on some level, right? And it's important to understand what you're getting into. With this, it's also important to say, hey, where does the yield come from? Core's Bitcoin staking, because you're part of our consensus mechanism, this is 81 years of sustainable rewards. It's not some sort of like yield farming or something else where like there's this short-termism and really high rates, like just trying to draw people in. Not that that's a bad thing, but again, go into the mindset of a Bitcoin holder. Hey, they've already been in this, participating in this thing for 15 years. You think about long-term, right? You want things that are sustainable, super easy to use, and it has to kind of remain on the L1. When you get into wrap Bitcoin staking, some of these other things, yes, there are ways you potentially like restake and do some of these things. Those are like pretty novel at this point, but I think will become a theme that not only we get involved in, but other folks get involved in, later this year. But it's important to know that there is some risk involved in that. What I do think, and we're going a little bit talking about the roadmap, we do have, a Bitcoin LST that's in the works as well, and that will take advantage of our native Bitcoin staking. And that will help kind of solve some of this, where it's, okay, not only do you have this ability to earn the yield, but then you can bring it into DeFi and then kind of start to combine those things. It's really one of the missing Lego blocks, if you will, of like Bitcoin DeFi. Also something that'll be a really hot area later this year.
Is the underlying mechanism for that Bitcoin LST essentially you do the same time lock, but instead of locking it to yourself, you lock it to like an LST provider like a Lido, and then they issue a receipt token for all the Bitcoin that's delegated to that operator?
So we're going to do a follow-up and we'll chat through all the details. We'll do it with the rollup. You guys will get the exclusive on it as soon as we start to talk a little more about it. This is just the tease.
Can I get one of those?
Sounds
Andy?
great. Sounds great.
How do we? It's not working. I don't know. It's not working.
Sounds very interesting, though.
Yeah,
I was a bit concerned that whether there be demand for this, but clearly there is.
Yeah, and I think we'll give one quick piece of that before I kind of dive over. I think if you look at a lot of these kind of like Bitcoin L2s that have actually amassed like a lot of Bitcoin right now, or like has had some point had a lot of Bitcoin, a lot of this is actually coming from Bitcoin miners. And a lot of this is, again, been sitting on this for a long time that wants more ability to go earn Bitcoin. And I think the amount of uptick in not only Core's Bitcoin stake, but some of these other protocols is going to be a lot faster than people thought. And what's important to think about is just the capital size of the Bitcoin asset base, right? Like it's $1.5 trillion today or whatever. If only a fraction of that comes in, and like the Ethereum proxy is like 10 to 30%, you're talking 100 billion plus, right? Like you're talking just such bigger magnitudes than we've ever seen in crypto. And again, a lot of that will stop at staking, but a bunch of that stuff will make its way to DeFi. And like we're going to see some of these DeFi protocols that just get absolutely enormous. Hopefully they've got good risks. Like, you have to worry about like all the bad things they have when things get big too quick, but there really is this whole unmet demand there, and just a very large, like the 9th largest, asset in the world. So
you think there will be any like the DeFi OGs, the Aves, the MakerDAOs, the synthetics that migrate over to the Bitcoin chain, or any of these Bitcoin rollups?
I think we'll see a lot of that happen, just because there's going to be way more capital at play, and if you don't support it, you're going to get left out. I think like originally I was pretty anti this view, but I'm starting to see it more and more. Is I actually see a path. And like I've talked about this earlier, but like it's becoming more of like a theme for me, is that I think Bitcoin will become the dominant asset by TVL within like 3 years. I think it could happen a lot faster than that. But I think if you compare like Bitcoin and ETH, and I don't want to start a religious war by talking about it, Bitcoin is like this super scarce hard money that makes it this amazing collateral asset. There's a little bit more debate in the ETH case. It's probably the most political way to say that. But I think I can see a case for like a lot of these protocols almost like redenominating in Bitcoin as time goes on. Can't give you an exact timeline for it. But whether or not that's the OG like DeFi protocols or new ones that spin up, that one's a little bit harder to tell. But I think a bunch of the OGs will add it because they've got amazing products already.
Makes sense. Cool.
Cool. I talked a little bit about Core BTC, so we can kind of jump through this one pretty quick. But so in addition to Bitcoin staking, we announced earlier, I think it was March, Core BTC. And the idea is this is the bridge, like kind of the enshrined bridge of Core. We do welcome all Bitcoin derivatives. We want to be the home of Bitcoin DeFi. We know it's all not going to be Core BTC, but we do think a large portion, can be. And this is a pretty interesting design where you have these lockers, these guardians. And the idea is it's an over-collateralized bridge. Again, there's no way to do like a fully trustless Bitcoin bridge. And the idea here, that should say trust minimized. I say that, wow. Okay, we got a slide edit afterwards, but there's no way to do a fully trustless Bitcoin bridge. This is trust minimized, and the idea is it's over-collateralized. So if one of the lockers does wind up acting malfeasant, you can always slash them as well, and they would pay a penalty for doing so. But that's kind of the way to think about it. There's a couple different like dominant, bridging approaches. We've seen this one become a little more common recently. And we think that there's some pretty cool like novel innovations that some groups like Thesis and others are working on that are kind of like insurance markets for these to make them more capital efficient. And we're, kind of staying abreast of all of these developments because whatever the best technology is that comes out there, Core will integrate, whether it's some of these more novel kind of insurance markets, or maybe eventually we can get to like trustless bridging with BitVM or, some other, new technology there. But that's kind of a quick piece. Happy to run through the diagram like in more detail is helpful as well.
Yeah. Just from the diagram, it looks pretty standard lock and mint type of bridge. My question there is like we've seen lock and mint where people lock into a multi-sig. Are the validators that are securing this locking, are they the same validators that secure the network? Like the whole DPoS soup is also securing the bridge, or are they two separate validator sets?
So it's a good question. It's not the main validator set of Core, and it's also not a traditional lock and mint. So anyone can act as a locker in this case. And the idea is you put up a requisite amount plus the safety margin of Core, and that will become multi-collateral, I believe, this quarter. But the idea is it's an over-collateralized bridge so that when you are locking, you're providing like essentially an insurance policy that you won't then go take their Bitcoin on the other side, right, is the way to think about it. And then if you act, again, Byzantine, your Core gets slashed and returned to the other folks. So that's the way to think about it. So I wouldn't say it's like a kind of a traditional lock and mint, if that makes sense, but it's like an over-collateralized bridge. That's why these like insurance markets or other things are so appealing, because Bitcoin's huge, right? So like if you have an over-collateralized bridge, and especially if it's only in Core today, although we'll support more assets soon, you're inherently limited by the amount of like Bitcoin you can take on just through this mechanism. But this was chosen because it's trust minimized. And like we're big believers, like, don't trust if you don't have to, because your alternatives are like BTC or something else, which are like truly trusted, right? So it's as we, I'm like a broken record here, but it's all about like walking that complexity ladder and just understanding which pieces you're comfortable with, which one you want to go with, and then what kind of ultimately matches your needs.
And then just a follow-up there, why would I commit any capital to providing this effectively like this loan or this over-collateralized or this capital opportunity for people to bridge? Like why would I do that?
Great question. You receive fees. So I think it's like 15 bips or something like that today. So it's a decently healthy fee. But yes, as with all things in crypto, if there's no incentive, people will not do it. So yes, you receive fees for doing so.
Cool.
HTLC atomic swaps. So this will get released later this month, I believe, depending on when this goes live. But the idea here is, and we've seen this with like groups like Thorchain and some of the like HTLC, which is like not necessarily super new, has gotten really hot in the last few years because it was traditionally used just for like P2P transactions, right? And like I'm not sure. I'll give you the quick background. The idea of like an HTLC atomic swap is like essentially like a if and only if set of conditions, right? It's like I agree to send Robbie 1 Bitcoin if and only if these certain criteria are met. There's no flexibility. It's like that is it. And traditionally there was a liveness component, and that's why it was mainly used for P2P transactions. Be like, hey, you meet in person, you'd swap, and or like something of that nature, roughly. But obviously it's trust minimized, which is great, but the liveness thing is really challenging, right? Where it's like you have to both be physically like in the same location. And I think it was ThorSwap, but it could have been someone else that did it first. They actually came up with a kind of a cool idea, which is, hey, what if we put a liquidity pool in the middle? And that helps kind of with some of this this liveness problem, right? Because you actually have like an AMM under the hood that allows you to facilitate these things, even if you're not in the same place at the same time. And that was really cool. Thorchain, one of the most interesting teams in crypto. They built so many cool things. If you haven't followed up with any of their recent stuff, like streaming swaps, etc., like really cool, definitely check it out. But on top of that, one of the kind of downsides, if you will, is now you add a centralization vector, right? Like there's something in the middle there, right? And again, for some folks, that's not a trade-off they're willing to make. For other folks, they don't care. It's again like understanding what works for you. For Core's approach, it was, all right, how do we get some of the best parts without necessarily trying to like centralize? So the idea is there's like this kind of novel, like kind of like order book in the middle that's like P2P. So instead of it being, just like for you and someone else, anyone else can kind of pick up on that as long as they meet those conditions still. So again, not as liquid as a liquidity pool, but also not having kind of that centralized intermediary. So it's pretty novel and interesting from that design. Atomic swaps, though, are really cool. And then again, like because you have this guarantee cryptographically, you don't have to trust anyone. And that is very cool, especially if you're thinking of going from like, Bitcoin to some other chain, which historically has a lot of issues doing things trustlessly, or at least in my opinion, isn't possible today with bridging.
And what do you expect the use case for this to be with regards to Core and Bitcoin? Do you just think that your community is going to want to swap to Bitcoin, and then the Bitcoin community is going to want to come to Core? Or is it? I kind of view it as mostly like, okay, we're going to onboard more Bitcoin to Core chain this way.
Yeah, that's like the target use case, I'd say. But there's also other ones, like you can use this for like BRC20s, runes, ordinals. Like you can use it. It's very generic in that way. It's really designed for the folks who aren't comfortable with bridging, if you will. And like this is kind of again so core to the core ethos, which is how do you have a product or an offering that matches every single person's trust assumption and their threshold they're willing to take. And again, like how I kind of think about it is a lot of people stop at Bitcoin stake. Well, there's some percentages do nothing. Then you go to Bitcoin staking. A lot of people stop there. Some people then or say, hey, I'm only willing to swap. Other people say I'm willing to bridge. And then it goes all the way down to like, crazy levered, over collateralized or under collateralized, like ordinals trades on a perp dex, like who knows how wild it gets to with like crazy kind of degen culture on Bitcoin, like starting to emerge. But it's important that you can kind of stop at any path or any part along that path.
Makes sense.
Cool. And then I talked a little bit about this already as well. But yeah, so again, so much general market cap in Bitcoin. It's so big, but it's just such a small part of TVL today. And there's so few Bitcoin focused dApps. All that is going to change drastically over the next few years. There's also some kind of pretty cool protocols that are products that are built on top of Core. They're also trying to onboard more and more people into this ecosystem in like a Web 2.5 fashion, if you will. There's Element Wallet, which is a messenger / P2P payments app, really trying to be like crypto on easy mode. Trying again, like we don't have products that can bring in the 6 billion Web 2 users because it's really hard or difficult to use. we're just never going to be able to like fully break out as an industry beyond some of these cases like speculation. And speculation itself is, a wonderful tool in a lot of ways. But think about stable coins. It's a 100x better solution for billions of people around the world. How do we get those in the hands? It has to be super friendly and easy to use. And that's really kind of one of the problems that Elman's trying to solve. There's also Satoshi app, which is this cashless onboarding platform, this way for folks to earn their first crypto, which helps kind of solve another big barrier on top of just knowledge, is how people get access to this ecosystem for the first time. And then when you can get access to that ecosystem, you can start to participate, earn yield, and then become kind of a full-fledged Web3 user, really trying to solve the education problem that we have in crypto that plagues, so many folks. The other like interesting kind of onboarding mechanic that Core is, trying to spearhead is the institutionalization of this next wave of Bitcoin scaling solutions. And we announced this about a month ago, but it was the first yield-bearing Bitcoin ETP with Valor. It actually has since launched in the Nordic regions. It's going to be taken throughout the world later this year, and then hopefully more products will get developed on top of it. But if we go back to that design of Core's Bitcoin staking, where it is truly trustless and non-custodial, it's this amazing product for these financial products, because they don't have to trust. There's no risk involved. What they can do is they can actually now go stake and earn additional yield to kind of get additional returns for these underlying financial products that they're offering. It's going to be a while before where Core Chain is starting to power like some of the stuff in the US, but there's kind of a whole path there as well. And the idea is Bitcoin holders now are not locked out of yield. People that are holding, Bitcoin in, their retirement accounts or whatever, so these ETPs should be locked out either. And like kind of my view on this personally is like we've unlocked kind of Pandora's box, where you'll probably see some ETH ETFs that have a stake maybe, later this year as maybe some of those get announced. Bitcoin yield, ETFs are coming too. And we just can't lock folks out anymore. People want additional, sources of returns that are safe. And then we also announced that a core ETP is also going to go live later this year, which is great for folks who, again, maybe aren't comfortable with, custodying crypto assets themselves. They'll be able to get that in, their various investment accounts and institutions be able to participate as well. So, yeah, a lot of work there. There hasn't been as much like experimentation on the institutional side, I would say, from some of these like next gen Bitcoin scaling solutions. So Core is happy to kind of help lead the pack. Bitcoin is really the only institutionally accepted crypto asset. So there's a lot of opportunity there for folks like Core to get involved. And then I think this is my last one for you guys. The Core Chain ecosystem is growing. And also for anyone listening to this, come chat with us. We're always excited to go chat with more builders. And there's this whole wave of like Bitcoin specialized apps that have already launched, and a whole wave behind them. And again, these are protocols really that are either like Bitcoin centric. So like NLX is like potentially on-chain BitMEX. So remember, BitMEX was all Bitcoin based. So they've got a whole purpose protocol that is actually Bitcoin based, which is super cool. There's Glyph, which is this inscriptions, AMM, and DEX, co-lend, borrow lend Bitcoins. There's so many things that are either launched or coming soon. But again, like this whole next wave of DeFi, I think we'll have this, Bitcoin focus behind it. And then on top of it, there's so many, amazing infrastructure providers that are helping to provide additional utility and resources for builders on top of the core chain, as well as a variety of different multi-chain dApps. So I think there's about 100 projects that are launched so far. We welcome, all projects to get involved. There's also the Core Ignition program right now, which is an incentive program for both users and builders. So it's a great way to get rewarded for the different, daily active users, TPL, et cetera, that you bring to the ecosystem, and also for your users for receiving rewards for participating, in your protocol. So it's a really like kind of surround sound 360 way to participate and get rewarded. And then, yeah, I'll leave it on the QR codes for different people to get involved, whether that's starting to read about us on Twitter, staking Bitcoin, or, downloading Element to go get involved in the core chain.
Yeah, thank you, Rich, for coming on and fielding our questions. And really been a pleasure to watch Core grow and think about these things from like what the Bitcoin community wants, this gradual spectrum of kind of risk parameters and desires for yield, and just kind of contribute to the longevity of Bitcoin. Yeah, look forward to jamming on some panels with some other builders and getting into some fiery debates about design choices, like always. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me, guys. Really appreciate it. Talk soon.
Thanks, Rich.